Welcome to VSOW, everybody. We're gonna be diving into the world of gene editing today,
Mm.
looking at all the ethical and societal implications.
Oh yeah, it's really a fascinating topic. A lot of debate, and for good reason, I think. Huge potential benefits,
Yep.
but also some big risks.
Okay, so let's clarify something right off the bat. We're talking
Mhm.
about gene editing, but there's actually two main types, right?
Yeah,
Somatic and germline. So
exactly.
can you break those down for us and explain why that's so crucial to this discussion?
Yeah. So somatic gene editing is when you're modifying genes in cells that aren't related to reproduction.
Okay.
So the changes you're making, they only affect that one individual. They don't get passed down to kids. Kind of like, correcting a typo
Right.
in a single copy of a book.
Makes sense.
Germline editing, though, that's different. We're talking about modifying genes in reproductive cells like sperm or eggs.
Mm-hmm.
So any changes you make there, they get passed down to future generations. It's like correcting a typo in the original manuscript of a book. So all the copies after that have that change.
So that heritability factor
Yeah.
is really what makes germline editing so much more ethically tricky.
Yeah, it's exactly.
With somatic editing, the risks are mostly limited to that one person.
Yeah.
But with germline, we're talking about potentially impacting future generations,
Yeah.
people who didn't even consent to this. So it raises all these really deep questions
Absolutely.
about our right to change, the very blueprint of humanity.
Yeah, it's a huge responsibility.
Okay, so let's get into some of those ethical questions by looking at the arguments that our sources are making. So you have Julian Savulescu, who's a bioethicist.
Right.
He's saying that we actually have a moral obligation to use gene editing to enhance well-being. Like, it's an extension of principles we already kind of embrace, like education or healthcare.
Uh-huh.
Can you unpack that a little bit more?
Yeah, so his argument, it comes from this utilitarian perspective, where the idea is to maximize well-being for everyone. And he says, if we have the technology to stop suffering and to boost human potential, we have a moral duty to use it. He's not just talking about curing diseases.
Wow.
He's talking about enhancing traits like intelligence, empathy, things like that, so we could have like a more flourishing society.
He even brings up the U.S. military,
Yeah.
their assessment of like the economic benefits of having a workforce with higher IQs.
Right. He uses that as evidence that even small improvements to IQ
Uh-huh.
could be hugely beneficial for society, like more productivity, more innovation, people better at solving problems.
But that brings up this question of, are we creating a society where we're valuing certain traits over others? And like Katie Hassan, who's from the Center for Genetics and Society, she pushes back on that. She
Yeah.
says focusing on IQ as like the measure of worth really narrows the conversation
Right.
and makes it less inclusive. How does she counter Savulescu's argument?
So she doesn't think we should be aiming for some kind of idealized version of humanity
Oh, good.
based on a small set of traits like just intelligence. She says this kind of thinking can lead to discrimination
Yeah.
against people who don't fit that mold, and it could even make existing inequalities worse.
And she also brings up that we already have ways to prevent genetic diseases,
Yeah.
like embryo screening or adoption,
Yeah.
without going into this ethically murky territory of germline editing.
Exactly. She thinks focusing on germline editing for preventing diseases distracts us from dealing with bigger societal problems
Right.
that contribute to health disparities, things like poverty or lack of access to health care.
So she's calling for a more holistic approach,
Right.
where we're addressing both the biological and the social factors that determine health,
Yes.
not just looking at gene editing as this quick fix.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got Jamie Metzel. He's a healthcare futurist.
Yeah.
He's kind of got a more nuanced take on this. He sees the potential benefits, but he stresses that we got to be really careful. We need ethical guidelines and regulation.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain his perspective a little bit more?
Yeah. So Metzel is kind of in the middle of this whole debate.
Okay.
He thinks gene editing could totally revolutionize healthcare and solve some of our biggest problems.
Right.
But he's also super aware of the potential for misuse
Yeah.
and the possibility of things going wrong.
He seems particularly concerned about this potential divide between the haves and have-nots.
Yeah. He's worried about a future where gene editing technology is only available to the wealthy.
Right.
And that could lead to the situation where rich people can enhance their kids' abilities and health, and poor people get left behind.
So he's calling for a global conversation, to figure out ethical frameworks and regulations to guide how we develop and use these technologies.
Exactly. He thinks we need a really thoughtful and inclusive dialogue, not just scientists and policymakers, but also ethicists, patients' disability rights, advocates, the public, everyone.
This leads us to some real-world examples and concerns. The story of Gabriel, a young boy with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, really shows the potential of CRISPR for treating these genetic diseases. Can you tell us more about his case and why it's so significant?
So Gabriel's story, it's really sad, but also hopeful. Duchenne muscular dystrophy, it's a horrible genetic disorder.
Right.
Causes progressive muscle weakness, eventually leads to premature death. There's no cure right now. But CRISPR, it offers this possibility of a cure. Scientists are working on gene editing therapies that could potentially slow down or even reverse the disease. So kids like Gabriel might have a chance at a longer, healthier life.
It really highlights how gene editing could alleviate suffering.
Yeah.
But it also brings up questions about access and affordability.
Absolutely.
If these therapies work, how do we make sure everyone who needs them can get them, regardless of how much money they have?
Yeah, that's a really important question, and it's something we're going to have to figure out as these technologies get closer to reality.
We also have an example that really shows the need for caution in gene editing research. The case of Jesse Gelsinger. He was an early gene therapy patient. He sadly died during a clinical trial.
Right.
Can you tell us about that?
So Jesse Gelsinger died back in 1999. It was a big setback for gene therapy. He had a rare genetic disorder, and he volunteered for this clinical trial, testing a new gene therapy approach. And tragically, he had a severe immune reaction to the treatment, and he died just a few days later.
You really highlighted how risky this research can be.
Yeah.
And the importance of having very strict safety protocols.
Right.
And ethical oversight.
It's a reminder that we're working with these incredibly powerful tools, and they can have unintended consequences that can even be fatal. So we have to be extremely careful and make sure patient safety is the top priority.
We're going to be diving deeper into these complexities and exploring the global race and regulation of gene editing in part 2 of our deep dive.
It was a terrible thing, but, it did kind of force the scientific community to really rethink things.
Yeah.
Led to stricter rules for trials and a bigger emphasis on keeping patients safe.
It also showed how important transparency is and making sure patients really understand the risks and the benefits before they agree to participate.
Absolutely. And that kind of brings us to another case that caused a lot of controversy.
Right.
The genetically edited babies in China.
Yeah. Can you remind us what happened there and why it sparked so much outrage?
So back in 2018, this Chinese scientist, he announced that he had used CRISPR to edit the genes of twin baby girls.
Wow.
While they were still embryos. And he said he had made them resistant to HIV. But a lot of people condemned his actions. They said it was unethical and irresponsible.
Wait.
Because he didn't follow the established protocols for germline editing.
Yeah.
And there were serious concerns about whether those babies would be healthy and safe. It also kind of raised the scary possibility of designer babies, where parents could pick and choose traits for their kids, like eye color or intelligence.
So this case really brought the ethical issues of germline editing to the forefront.
It did. It went beyond just using gene editing to treat diseases. It showed that it could be used for enhancement.
Yeah.
And that opens up a whole new can of worms ethically.
It also highlights the need for countries to work together.
Yes.
To set ethical boundaries and regulations.
Absolutely. This technology, it doesn't stop at borders. We need everyone on the same page about how to move forward responsibly and ethically.
So we have Nawal Akram, who's a disability rights activist. What are some of her concerns about how gene editing could impact people with disabilities?
So Akram's argument is that if we only focus on getting rid of genetic conditions through gene editing, we might end up further marginalizing people with disabilities.
Right.
She points out that right now, medical care and accommodations for people with disabilities are often not good enough. And she worries that gene editing could be used to erase differences instead of celebrating them.
So she's saying we need to change how we think about disability.
Yeah.
Instead of seeing it as something to fix, we should focus on building a society that includes and accepts everyone.
Exactly. She wants us to think about whether eliminating certain genetic traits really means we value and respect people with disabilities.
It's a really important point. It reminds us that technology should be guided by ethics, and a commitment to social justice.
And it shows why it's so important to include different perspectives in these discussions.
Yeah.
We need to hear from the people who would be most affected by gene editing technology.
Now let's talk about the global race
Yeah.
and the regulations around gene editing.
Yeah.
There's intense competition
Yeah.
between countries like the U.S. and China to be leaders in this field.
Right.
What are some of the implications of that?
Well, it's a high-stakes race. Both countries see gene editing as the key to being dominant scientifically and economically in the future. The U.S. has always been a leader in biomedical research, but China is catching up fast. They're investing a ton of money in gene editing technologies and attracting the best scientists.
And their approaches to regulation are quite different, right?
Yeah, the U.S. is more cautious. They have stricter regulations on germline editing, while China has been more willing to push the limits, like we saw with the gene-edited babies.
That difference in regulation is concerning.
Yeah.
It could lead to this race to the bottom,
Yeah.
where countries with looser rules attract scientists who want to do research that would be banned elsewhere.
Exactly. It shows why it's so crucial to have international cooperation
Yeah.
and to make regulations more consistent around the world. That way we can prevent people from exploiting these technologies in unethical ways.
So we need to find a balance between scientific progress and ethical considerations and global security.
It's a tough balancing act. But we need to find ways to encourage innovation while making sure these powerful technologies are used responsibly.
For the good of everyone.
Yeah, for all of humanity.
So we've talked about needing a strong ethical framework. Can you talk a bit more about what that might look like?
Sure. A strong ethical framework for gene editing would have to address a few key questions. First, what are the acceptable ways to use this technology?
Okay.
Should it only be for treating diseases? Or can we use it for enhancement too?
Yeah.
Second, who should be able to access these technologies? How do we make sure everyone has equal access and prevent discrimination? And third, how do we manage the risks and the unintended consequences?
Right.
What safety protocols and oversight mechanisms do we need?
And we need to develop this framework by having open and inclusive discussions
Yeah,
with scientists, ethicists, policymakers, patients, and the public.
absolutely. And we need to have these conversations now before these technologies become widely available.
We can't afford to wait until it's too late.
Right. We have to proactively shape the future of gene editing
Yeah.
in a way that matches our values
Yeah.
and our hopes for a just and equitable society.
Feels like we're at this really crucial point in history. You know, gene editing it has the potential to completely change humanity in good ways and bad.
Oh, for sure. It's like we're standing at a crossroads. The choices we make now, they'll impact generations to come.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some key things our listeners should keep in mind as they try to make sense of this whole complicated and constantly evolving situation?
Well, first, I think it's really important to remember that gene editing isn't just one thing. There are different types, and they have different levels of ethical complexity.
Right.
Somatic gene editing that targets the cells that aren't related to reproduction, that's usually seen as less controversial than germline editing, which is the one that changes the DNA that gets passed down to future generations.
So when we're talking about the ethics of gene editing, it's crucial to be clear about what type we're actually discussing.
Exactly. And another thing to remember is gene editing, it's not a magic bullet. It's this powerful tool with huge potential. But it's not a solution for every single problem. We have to be realistic about what it can and can't do. And we need to think about the risks along with the benefits.
And those risks, they're not just limited to the individual. We need to consider the potential impact on society as a whole, like the possibility of making existing inequalities worse, or even creating new forms of discrimination.
Absolutely. If only wealthy or privileged people have access to gene editing technologies, it could create this genetic divide that further splits society.
So this goes way beyond just the science. It's about ethics, equity, social justice, all of that.
It's all connected. We need to have these really thoughtful and inclusive discussions about the values and principles that should guide how we develop and use these technologies.
And we need to be having those conversations right now, before these technologies become widely available.
We can't just wait and see what happens. We have to be proactive in shaping the future of gene editing. Make sure it aligns with our values and our hopes for a fair and just society.
So what can our listeners do to be a part of this important conversation?
Well, first off, stay informed. Read articles, watch documentaries, listen to podcasts like this one
Right.
to really understand gene editing and the ethical issues it raises. Talk to your family and friends about it. Share what you've learned. Encourage them to think critically about these things.
And reach out to your elected officials. Let them know you care about responsible gene editing policy.
Yes. And support organizations that are working to make sure everyone has equal access to these technologies and that are pushing for ethical guidelines for how they're developed and used.
The future of gene editing is in our hands. We need to work together to make sure these powerful tools are used wisely and with compassion so they benefit all of humanity.
I completely agree.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the world of gene editing. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. And thanks for listening to VSOW.